It happened on Christmas Eve. I still remember the sound of the spoon slamming against the wooden table, sharp and final like the snap of a frozen branch. Outside, snow was falling over Burlington, Vermont, soft and quiet, like the world had no idea what was about to happen inside this house. I was 30 years old, standing at the edge of the dining room, watching the twinkling yellow Christmas lights reflecting on the window. My stepbrother Ryan sat across from me drunk, his cheeks flushed, his eyes locked on me like I was the reason his soup tasted wrong. Linda, my stepmother, sat at the other end, swirling her wine with that faint, practiced smile. My father Thomas lifted his glass, but said nothing. The silence was heavy, the kind that wrapped around your throat before anyone touched you. I reached for my glass of water, and that tiny movement set everything in motion. Ryan's spoon slammed down again. "You can't even make soup right," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. I didn't say a word. I never did. Not around him, not around her. They liked me better silent. Linda smirked and said, "Oh, don't be dramatic, Ryan." It sounded casual, but it was her favorite weapon, that tone. That was how she had disarmed me my entire life. Ryan pushed his chair back and stood up, his boots creaking against the hardwood floor. The garland hanging from the archway swayed slightly from the movement, like it already knew what was coming. My hands were cold even though the room was warm. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, but beneath it was something sour and stale, something I could never forget. Ryan's steps were uneven, heavy with whiskey. "Look at me when I talk to you," he hissed. I lifted my eyes slowly, just enough to meet his glare. He hated that I could stay calm. He hated everything about me. His voice rose ugly and raw, and Linda didn't stop him. She never did. Thomas looked down at his drink. That was his version of being a father. Ryan grabbed the garland hanging from the doorway. It was thick, rough, the kind you wrapped around wreaths. His fingers curled around it like it was made for this moment. He took one slow step toward me. My heart didn't race. It froze. I could feel the texture of the chair under my hand, the grain of the wood, the soft hum of the heater in the corner. Then his voice cut through it. "You've always thought you were better than us. It wasn't about the soup. It never was. It was about years of quiet rage about a family that treated me like a ghost. I didn't see it coming. He moved too fast for a man that drunk. The garland brushed my cheek, then tightened around my neck in one single pull. The first sound was the scraping of the rope against my skin, a coarse hiss that sliced through the silence. I clawed at it, but he was taller, stronger, his grip steady. My feet stumbled backward against the table. A glass shattered on the floor. My breath caught halfway in my throat, a burning pressure spreading up my face. My ears rang. I heard Linda's laugh, soft and deliberate, like the sound of someone closing a door. Thomas didn't move. He sat still, holding his drink like this was just another family argument. I remember the lights blinking above the window. Green, red, gold. My vision blurred at the edges, colors bleeding together. Ryan leaned closer, his breath hot and bitter with alcohol. "You don't belong here," he whispered. His voice was low and almost calm. It felt like he had been waiting years for this. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My hands clawed at the rope. My nails scraped skin, but it didn't matter. The air was gone. My knees hit the floor. The world narrowed to one single thread of light above me, flickering like the last ember in a dying fire. Somewhere behind me, the soup still steamed on the table. Cinnamon, pine, copper. My lungs convulsed, desperate and empty, and then something inside me went quiet. Not panic. Not fear. Quiet. Ryan's hands didn't shake. Mine did. The house creaked with the weight of old secrets and old cruelty. When my heart stopped, it wasn't loud. It was almost gentle. The rope burned against my neck, a final line drawn after a lifetime of being told to stay silent. I felt myself slip into a cold, soundless place where Christmas lights looked like tiny floating stars. My last image before everything faded was Linda watching me with a glass of wine in her hand, the corner of her mouth curved upward. They thought that was the end, but silence is dangerous when it learns how to speak. This was the night everything changed. At 3 in the morning on Christmas Eve, my heart stopped, but my silence did not. Before we continue, tell me, have you ever felt unheard in your own family? Comment. Yes, if you have. I was 6 years old when my mother died. I remember the hospital room more clearly than I should. The smell of disinfectant, the stiff white sheets, the sound of someone's shoes on the linoleum floor. My father held my hand loosely like it was something breakable, but his eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the wall. 2 months later, Linda moved into the house with her perfect hair and her sharp smile. She came with a son. Ryan was 9, and he looked at me like I had taken something from him. Maybe he was right. Maybe we were both children learning what it meant to lose something, but the way he turned that loss into a weapon was something I didn't understand until years later. The first Christmas after my mother died, Linda hung shiny gold garlands on the staircase and told me to smile. She wore red lipstick, the kind that left stains on wine glasses. She held me by the shoulders during the family photo. My dress was itchy. Ryan kicked me in the leg right before the camera clicked, and when I yelped, Linda whispered through her smile, "Stop making a scene." That phrase stayed with me like a bruise that never quite faded. Ryan started small. A push here, a shove there, whispered insults when no one was listening. He learned early that Linda would never believe me, and my father would never interfere. Thomas was the kind of man who pretended that problems disappeared if he stared long enough at his newspaper. I learned quickly how to swallow words. At 8, I started sitting at the edge of the dinner table, quiet, small, invisible. That became my place in the house. When I turned 10, Ryan held my favorite snow globe over the staircase railing and let it drop. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces across the floor. Linda didn't scold him. She told me to stop crying, said it was only glass. But it wasn't. It was the last thing my mother gave me. I didn't tell her that. She wouldn't have cared. Every winter after that felt colder no matter how many decorations she forced around the house. By 13, I understood the rhythm of their cruelty. Ryan learned to bruise in places that didn't show. Linda learned how to smile in ways that made everything look normal. Thomas perfected silence. Each Christmas was a stage play, and we all had our lines. They played the happy family. I stood in the corner smiling for the camera, counting down the seconds until I could disappear into my room. I remember one Christmas when the snow fell heavy outside and Linda made me sit next to Ryan on the couch. His hand pressed too hard on my shoulder. I stared at the blinking lights on the tree until they blurred together. I didn't cry. I learned early that tears were a language no one in this house spoke. At 16, the resentment turned sharper. Ryan would mock everything about me, from the way I talked to the way I dressed. He called me Ghost Girl because I never made noise. Linda laughed at that nickname over her wine like it was a joke between them. Thomas would shift uncomfortably but never stop them. That was when I began to plan my escape without even knowing it. Every slammed door, every whispered insult, every night I lay awake listening to their laughter from the living room became a brick in the wall I was building inside. On my 18th birthday, I packed everything I owned into a single duffel bag. No one noticed I was leaving. I walked down the front steps at dawn. It was snowing, the kind that covered everything in a clean white sheet like pretending was easy. I didn't look back. I left Burlington for Montpelier and didn't return for 10 years. I enrolled in a design program, worked late shifts, built a life where no one could touch me without my permission. I thought distance would be enough. I thought silence was a kind of armor, but silence has a way of following you. Even in my first tiny apartment every Christmas Eve, I would hear phantom footsteps in the hallway. Remember the taste of cold soup, the sound of garland scraping my skin, the sting of being unseen. I decorated my space with soft lights and no family photos. I made sure no one sat across from me at dinner. I told myself that was freedom. For 10 years, I didn't come home. 10 years of pretending that the past was behind me. I built a life that was quiet, controlled mine. But the past has sharp edges. It doesn't stay buried. It waits. I didn't know it then, but every year I spent away was pulling me closer to the night when everything would break. That house didn't forget me, and I hadn't really left it. Not completely. The postcard arrived on a gray morning that smelled like snow. It slid under my apartment door with the rest of the mail, its glossy front showing a carefully chosen image of a pine tree covered in lights, the kind of thing you'd find on cheap greeting cards in a grocery store. I almost threw it away with the junk mail until I saw the handwriting on the back. It wasn't Linda's elegant loops or Ryan's angry scribbles. It was Thomas, my father. He had never written to me in 10 years. For a moment, I just stared at the uneven blue ink. Evelyn, it would be good to see you. Come home for Christmas. Dad. The words were simple, clumsy, even like they were pulled out of him reluctantly. I ran my thumb across the paper. The edges were sharp. I should have ignored it. I made coffee and sat by the small window in my Montpelier apartment. Outside, the roofs were already dusted white, and the sound of a plow rumbled faintly down the street. My life was small but quiet. I liked it that way. My work as an interior designer wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. I chose every piece of furniture in my apartment, every lamp, every muted color. No one yelled here. No one touched me without permission. Silence in this space wasn't dangerous. It was mine. But the card sat on the table like a ghost. I tried to imagine Thomas writing it. He wasn't the type to send invitations. He wasn't the type to reach out at all. Something about it didn't fit. Then the call came from a number I didn't recognize, a lawyer's office in Burlington. They wanted to notify me of a scheduled family meeting regarding the sale of the Rhodes property. My chest tightened. The house, the one that had held everything rotten between us. If it was just about a family dinner, I could have thrown the card away. But a sale meant money. It meant secrets and intentions. And they never invited me to anything involving money. I sat with that thought for hours. I ran my fingers over the rim of my coffee mug until it went cold. Going back there was the last thing I wanted. The smell of the garland, the sharp sting of being invisible, the memory of Ryan's voice had followed me my whole adult life. Returning felt like stepping back into a cage I had already escaped. But there was something different now. I wasn't the girl who swallowed words anymore. I had a job. I had my own space. I had proof that I didn't need them. If they were planning something behind my back, I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I opened my laptop and stared at the train schedule between Montpelier and Burlington. It was only a few hours. That made it worse somehow how close the past was. A simple train ride away. I imagined the house again, the steep roof, the old maple tree in the front yard, the way snow used to pile on the porch steps. I imagined Linda standing in the doorway with her perfect lipstick and Ryan leaning against the railing, smirking like he owned everything. I could almost hear their voices. Come home, Evelyn. Pretend everything is fine. Be quiet. I didn't owe them a thing, but there was a part of me that needed to know what they were planning. Maybe it was about the house. Maybe it was something worse. People like Linda didn't make moves without calculating every angle, and Thomas never acted unless someone pushed him. That postcard was a move, a soft trap wrapped in holiday cheer. I picked up the card again. The word Dad felt wrong on the page. It felt like something borrowed from someone else's life. I poured the cold coffee down the sink, grabbed my planner, and started making a list of what I needed to bring. Not gifts, not warm memories, information. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the radiator hum. A thin crack of wind slipped through the window frame. I thought about the last time I stood in that house. I had been 18 wearing a coat that didn't fit anymore, holding a bag too small for the weight I carried. I had walked out without saying goodbye. For 10 years, that was the only moment I replayed when I thought about family. But now there was another image forming. Me walking back through that door, not as the quiet girl, but as someone who knew how to see through their lies. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase. One set of professional clothes, one pair of boots, my documents, my phone charger. I told no one where I was going. There was no one to tell. I locked the door behind me, but as I did, I felt the chill of a memory slip through the cracks. The past had a way of waiting, and now I was heading straight toward it. I didn't go back for Christmas dinner. I didn't go back for closure. I went back to understand what game they were playing, and this time I wasn't planning to lose. The dining room smelled like pine and roasted meat, the kind of carefully staged holiday scene that photographs well but never feels real. The table was long dressed in a white cloth with gold stitching candles flickering on either end. I sat facing Ryan with Linda sitting in the middle like a queen presiding over her court. Thomas sat at the head of the table, hands folded loosely around a glass of red wine, the same way he always sat during these dinners. The snow outside piled against the window panes, muffling the world into silence. It should have felt warm. It didn't. Ryan leaned back in his chair with the kind of lazy arrogance I remembered too well. He had on an expensive watch, flashing it deliberately as he reached for his wine. "Business has been good this year," he said, his voice loud and casual, like he wanted to make sure I knew. "I closed 3 properties just this quarter. It's insane how easy it is when you know the right people." He grinned and looked directly at me as if this was all somehow meant for my ears. Linda smiled that sharp smile, the one that cut without raising its voice. "You've always had a good instinct for opportunity, Ryan. Not everyone does." She turned her head toward me without really looking at me. "Some people choose smaller lives." Her tone was sweet, but it dripped with the same venom I grew up with. I didn't respond. I picked up my spoon, stirred the soup, let it cool. I had learned long ago that silence hurt them more than anything else. But even silence couldn't stop the old pattern from snapping shut around me like a trap. Ryan rested his elbows on the table. "You still living in that little apartment in Montpelier? What do you even do again? Something with houses, right?" He tilted his head, pretending to think. "Interior design? Must be cozy." Linda's laugh followed soft and low, like wind slipping under a door. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. They had always done this poke-smirk laugh. It was never about what they said. It was about watching me absorb it like I always did. Thomas cleared his throat, a sound that meant nothing, and stared down into his glass. He would drink his way through the whole night. He always did. Then Linda shifted the conversation. "Thomas and I were talking about the house," she said lightly, like this wasn't a knife being slowly drawn out of its sheath. "The market's strong right now. It might be time to finally sell." I set my spoon down carefully. "Sell." Ryan grinned. "It's not like you'd have any use for it. You've been gone forever. We've kept it up all these years. It makes sense that we handle the sale." Linda nodded as if it were already decided. "Of course your father wanted you to be informed. That's why we invited you." Her voice wrapped around the word informed like a leash. Not asked, not included, informed. I felt the air in the room shift. That house had been my mother's before it became theirs. My name was on a piece of that land whether they liked it or not. And they didn't like it. Ryan leaned forward, spoon in hand, his voice a little too smooth. "We'll handle everything. You don't have to worry your little creative head about it." He laughed and Linda joined in. I said nothing, but inside, something old and sharp stirred awake. I watched their mouths move, listened to the sound of their voices wrapping the word family around betrayal. I studied every word, every smile, every quiet dismissal, and I stored it. The soup sat untouched in front of me. Ryan lifted his spoon, took a sip, and made a show of wincing. "God, this is bland." He slammed the spoon against the table. The sharp metal sound cut through the quiet like a blade. Linda didn't flinch. Thomas didn't look up. Ryan leaned back in his chair, smirk twisting wider. "Guess some things never change." I stared at the steam curling from the bowl and let the weight of their voices settle over me like it always had. This was the same house, the same table, the same old dance. But what they didn't see, not yet, was that I wasn't the same girl they used to silence. I had spent years building a life outside these walls, and now every word they threw felt less like a wound and more like evidence. The candles flickered. The snow pressed against the glass. Their laughter slid around the room like smoke. I didn't give them the satisfaction of reacting. I just sat there, quiet, steady, memorizing the sound of the spoon against the table. Because I knew one day, very soon, that sound would not belong to them anymore. The house was silent except for the hum of the old heater and the occasional pop from the wood beams as they settled against the cold. It was the kind of silence that had always existed here, a silence built from words that should have been spoken but never were. I stood in the kitchen barefoot, the tiles icy beneath my feet. The lights above the counter were dim, the only real glow coming from the string of Christmas bulbs along the archway. I poured a glass of water and watched the reflection of those lights shimmer against the surface. My hands were steady. My heart was not. I heard him before I saw him. Ryan's footsteps were uneven, heavy, and slow. The door creaked open and his voice slurred from the hallway. "Well, look who's still here." He staggered into the kitchen, his hair sticking up his shirt untucked, smelling like a bottle that had been emptied long before midnight. He had always carried his arrogance like a weapon, but tonight it was heavier, sharper. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, though it sounded less like a question and more like an accusation. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. His presence was like static in the air, a pressure that made everything else feel smaller. He walked closer, leaned against the doorframe and picked up where he had left off hours earlier. "You know," he said, his voice rising, "you're the same. You come back here after all this time and think you matter. You don't." I sipped my water. "It's late, Ryan. Go to bed." He laughed loud and humorless. "Oh, is that it?" Little Evelyn, always so calm, always so perfect. The outsider who thinks she's better than everyone else. "You think this house belongs to you?" I looked up from the glass, my voice low, even sharper than I'd intended. "I don't owe you anything." Something in his expression snapped. The smirk disappeared, replaced by a hardness I had only seen in flashes before. His jaw clenched, and he took one unsteady step forward, then another. "Say that again," he hissed. I didn't. I didn't have to. The air between us thickened. His breathing turned louder, ragged. I could smell the alcohol, bitter and raw. His hands curled into fists at his sides. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Linda was standing at the edge of the kitchen, still wearing her silk robe, a glass of wine in her hand, watching. Her face was calm, almost bored. She wasn't going to stop him. She never did. Ryan's hand reached up toward the garland draped across the archway. It was the same one that had hung there since I was a child, thick, rough green plastic wrapped with gold ribbon. I saw his fingers curl around it, slow and deliberate, like he was choosing it. "You don't belong here," he said. The distance between us vanished in a breath. 1 second I was holding a glass of water. The next, the garland was around my neck. The first pull wasn't tight. It was almost careful, like he wanted to feel me react. I didn't scream. My body stiffened, my hand shooting up to grab the rope. Then the second pull came. It was harder. The edge of the garland scraped against my throat, and air stopped moving the way it should. I tried to push him back, but his weight came down like a wall. The sound in the room changed. The hum of the heater faded. All I could hear was my heartbeat slamming against my ribs, faster and faster, then skipping. I gasped, but the air didn't come. Ryan's hands didn't shake. They should have. He was drunk. But they didn't. He was steady, focused. I clawed at the rope nails, scraping skin, my feet slipping on the cold tile. A chair knocked over behind me, crashing to the floor, but no one came. No one ever came. Linda's shadow shifted near the doorway. She took a slow sip of wine. I locked eyes with her as I struggled to breathe. She did nothing. She tilted her head slightly, almost like she was curious about how long I would last. The burning started in my chest first. It spread upward, a fire that seared the back of my throat. My vision narrowed. The world tilted. I could see the lights above the kitchen blinking faintly red, green, gold, swimming together like smeared paint. My legs kicked out against the floor, but found no ground. I could feel the blood pounding in my temples, the raw, scraping sound of the garland cutting deeper into my skin. My hands started to shake weaker now, less control. He leaned closer. I could smell the sour liquor on his breath. "You were never part of this family," he whispered like a secret he'd been waiting years to say out loud. The rope tightened. My body jerked against his strength, but it was useless. My chest convulsed, trying to drag in air that wouldn't come. The edges of the room blurred, my ears filled with a high-pitched ringing, drowning out everything else. Somewhere far away, a clock chimed. 3 bells. 3 o'clock. I tried to think about anything but the pressure on my throat. I tried to remember the smell of my apartment in Montpelier after the rain. I tried to imagine the sound of quiet that belonged to me, but all I could feel was the world closing in, the last bit of oxygen scraping against my lungs, the last spark of control slipping away. Linda stood there unmoving. Ryan's grip tightened once more. Something in my chest gave out a sudden hollow silence, replacing the pounding. My knees hit the floor. My fingers went slack. The kitchen tilted sideways and the lights blurred into streaks of gold. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the edge of Linda's glass catching the light, her lips curling into that soft, cold smile she wore at every Christmas dinner. It was almost gentle. Almost. The paramedics said later that my heart stopped in the back of the ambulance at 3:00 a.m. I don't remember the sirens. I don't remember the hands pressing against my chest, the sharp commands, the oxygen mask. I remember only the feeling of cold swallowing me whole, the quiet that wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of surrender, of a lifetime of being silenced. But in that stillness, something inside me did not break. It shifted. I felt it like a thread being pulled tight. If I lived, I would not come back to this house as the girl who swallowed everything. If I lived, they would finally see what silence can do when it chooses to strike back. In that darkness, I made no promises out loud. I didn't need to. My heartbeat, when it came back, carried them for me. The first thing I heard was the steady rhythm of a machine. It was faint at first, a distant metronome beating inside a world I wasn't sure I belonged to anymore. My throat burned, every breath scraping raw against the inside of my chest. When I opened my eyes, the light above me was harsh and cold. Not the warm gold of Christmas lights, but the sterile white of a hospital ceiling. There was a mask strapped to my face. My hands were cold. My neck ached as if someone had pressed fire into my skin and let it stay there. I tried to swallow and felt the sting. A nurse leaned over me, adjusting something on a monitor, her face kind but practiced. "You're awake," she said softly. Her voice was the first sound that didn't hurt. "You're at the University of Vermont Medical Center. You were brought in early this morning." I blinked slowly. The edges of the night before slid back into my head, piece by piece. Ryan's breath, the rope, Linda's smile, my knees hitting the floor. It didn't come all at once. It came like a film I couldn't turn off. I reached up, fingers brushing the bandage around my throat. The nurse gently lowered my hand. "Don't touch that, honey. You're safe here. Safe." The word felt foreign. The door opened and a man in a dark uniform stepped inside. His badge caught the light. His voice was calm, the way people sound when they know the truth before you speak. "Ms. Rhodes, I'm Officer Parker. I just have a few questions for you if that's all right." His eyes were steady, not kind, but not cruel either. I nodded, my throat too raw to say yes. He pulled a chair closer to the bed. "We received a call from your family around 3 this morning. You were brought in unconscious. The paramedics said your heart stopped in the ambulance, but they were able to stabilize you." He paused, watching my face. "Your stepmother said it was an accident. That you slipped on a piece of garland and it got caught around your neck. Is that true?" I stared at him. His voice didn't falter when he said the word accident. It hung in the air between us like something he didn't quite believe. My hands clenched the edge of the blanket. I wanted to speak, but the words scraped like sandpaper inside my throat. The nurse handed me a small pad and pen. My handwriting was shaky, uneven, but the words were clear. "No." Officer Parker's eyes flicked down, then up again. "Do you want to make a statement?" I froze. In my mind, I could still see Linda standing there, wine in hand. I could still hear Ryan whispering that I didn't belong. If I said yes, it wouldn't just be about him. It would be about all of it, the years of silence, the weight of pretending. And yet, I also knew exactly what they would do. Linda would twist everything. Thomas would look at the floor. Ryan would smirk. It was a pattern I had lived my entire life. I wrote again, slower this time. "Not now." He didn't press me. "I'll leave my card here," he said, placing it gently on the table next to the bed. "If you decide to talk, call me. We'll listen." He stood, nodded, and walked out. When the door closed, I felt the cold return. Linda had lied. I didn't even need to hear her voice to know how convincing it had sounded. She'd always been good at it. Years of hosting dinners, smiling for neighbors, pretending her family was perfect. She could spin a story and make anyone believe it. Ryan wasn't in handcuffs. He was probably still at the house, probably sleeping it off like nothing happened. I lay there for hours listening to the machines, letting the numbness settle into something heavier. My throat ached with every breath, but the ache was nothing compared to the quiet fury beginning to spread through my chest. For 30 years, I had swallowed their version of reality. I had stayed silent because silence had always been the safer choice. But last night proved something. It didn't keep me safe. It almost killed me. The nurse returned around noon. "Your family called," she said carefully. "They said they'll pick you up whenever you're ready. We can keep you here another day if you need more rest." Family. I let the word roll around in my head. It didn't fit anymore. It felt like wearing someone else's clothes. I shook my head. "I'll sign myself out," I whispered, my voice breaking on the last word. I dressed slowly, fingers brushing against the bruises blooming around my throat. Each touch was a reminder of the rope of Ryan's steady hands. I caught my reflection in the small bathroom mirror. The marks were clear angry red and purple lines across pale skin. No one could call this a slip. But Linda would try. She always did. I walked out of the ICU alone. Outside the large window at the end of the hall, snow fell quietly over the parking lot. Burlington looked peaceful in the way only winter mornings could. The world kept moving while I had been caught between breaths. I stood there for a long time, my hospital wristband still on my throat, still burning. And then I whispered it to myself, the first words that felt like mine in years. "This ends now." It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even loud, but it was real. It was mine. I signed the discharge papers without asking for a ride. The nurse asked if someone was coming to get me. I shook my head. I didn't need them. I didn't want them. I called a cab and waited by the automatic doors with my coat zipped high against the cold. The snow had thickened. The sky was gray, but it was the kind of gray that made everything feel sharp, like every edge of the world had been outlined in ice. As the car pulled away from the hospital, I glanced back once. The lights on the roof of the building flickered faintly against the storm. Somewhere behind those walls, my heart had stopped. But out here, it was beating again, steady and cold. Linda could lie. Ryan could smirk. Thomas could look away. But something had shifted. I wasn't the girl they had built their story around anymore. I was the woman who lived through it. And I was done staying quiet. The bruises around my throat were still fading when I returned to my apartment in Montpellier. The cold bit harder than before, as if winter itself was listening. I shut the door behind me and stood in the quiet for a long time. My coat was still on my boots, still wet with snow. I wasn't trembling anymore. That was gone. What was left was something quieter and sharper. It wasn't fear. It was strategy. I sat down at my kitchen table, turned on the small desk lamp, and opened a blank notebook. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just enduring them. I was planning. The first step was to collect everything I could use. Ryan had always been careless. Cruel men like him often are. I opened the old wooden box that sat in the back of my closet. Inside were fragments I had kept over the years without really knowing why, old texts he sent me when I first moved out, voicemail recordings. He left when he was drunk, receipts from family events. Anything that smelled of control. I charged my phone, opened the archive, and started pulling up every message that reeked of the entitlement he had never tried to hide. The threats were subtle, the way abusers make them words wrapped in jokes, but the intent clear. "Don't forget who owns that house, Ev. You'll always be the outsider." They weren't just words anymore. They were evidence. Next, I remembered the camera. My father had installed an old security camera system years ago. He never figured out how to turn it off properly. I still had access to the backdoor login from when I helped him set it up as a teenager. I opened my laptop and typed in the IP address from memory. My breath caught when the old interface appeared. No one had changed the password. I went straight to the night of the attack. The kitchen feed had recorded everything in grainy black and white. Ryan walking in, Linda at the doorway, the garland, my body falling. I watched it once, just once, enough to know the image was clear, enough to feel something cold and precise settle in my chest. I downloaded the footage to an encrypted drive. Then I called the number on the business card Officer Parker had left on my bedside table at the hospital. His voice on the line was steady. "Miss Rhodes, I've been waiting for your call. I told him I had video. Real evidence." His tone changed. "I'll arrange for you to come down and file a full report. Bring everything." But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. People like Linda and Ryan didn't just manipulate rooms, they manipulated narratives. They lied with practiced ease. I needed someone who could cut through that, someone who understood the law better than they understood deception. So I made another call. Rebecca Cole had a reputation in Burlington. 42 years old, sharp as ice, a civil attorney with a history of taking on ugly family cases and winning them. I sat across from her the next afternoon in her office surrounded by snow-dusted windows and the smell of black coffee. She wore a simple dark blazer and listened without interrupting as I told her everything. Not just the attack, but the years that led to it. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "You've survived a long war," she said quietly. "And now you've got ammunition." She tapped the folder where I'd placed the printed screenshots and the USB drive. "This isn't just a defense. This is exposure. We don't just burn them, we expose them." The way she said it made something in me unclench. She wasn't talking about a private reckoning. She was talking about pulling the curtain down in front of everyone. We mapped it out step by step. I would file my official statement with the Burlington Police Department backed by the footage and the messages. Rebecca would initiate a petition to contest the sale of the house, freezing any legal transfer of property while charges were pending. She would also prepare a civil suit. It wasn't about money. It was about control, taking it back piece by piece. But there was one more thing, the family meeting. Linda had sent an email through Thomas's account inviting me to a discussion about the house. She was trying to make it look like a peaceful resolution. It wasn't. That meeting was going to be their performance, and I was going to record it. I bought a small wireless mic the next morning, small enough to clip inside my sweater. Rebecca helped me file for legal permission to record since it was my property and my case. Vermont was a one-party consent state. They had no idea I knew that. The days leading up to the meeting were quiet but sharp. I moved through them with the kind of stillness that doesn't mean calm, it means focus. I went to work, sat through meetings with clients, smiled when required. But every night I came home, I opened that notebook and added to the plan. Call logs, timeline, copies of the security footage stored in 3 different places, a printed statement ready to hand to Parker. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a blueprint. For years they had relied on my silence. It had been their greatest advantage. But silence can be turned into a weapon when it's sharpened with intent. On January 10th, the night before the meeting, I stood in my apartment staring at the folder on my kitchen table. Inside it were everything they thought I'd never collect: evidence, documents, statements, truth. Outside, snow fell quietly. 10 years ago, I would have heard that sound and thought of everything I lost in that house. Now it sounded different. It sounded like a beginning. I whispered to the empty room. "You don't get to write the ending anymore." My voice didn't shake. It didn't have to. The quiet had teeth now. The snow outside Burlington was melting in thin sheets along the sidewalks, leaving the city coated in a damp gray light. The lawyer's conference room was bright and sterile, all polished wood and sharp edges. I sat at the far end of the long rectangular table with Rebecca on my right, her dark blazer crisp against the clean white walls. My hands were folded in my lap, steady in a way they hadn't been weeks ago. Today wasn't about surviving. Today was about exposing. Linda was the first to arrive. She walked in like she owned the room, wrapped in a heavy cream-colored coat with a fur collar, makeup, flawless lipstick, a practiced red. She greeted Rebecca with a smooth, polite smile, the kind she'd used her entire life to convince people she was harmless. Behind her came Ryan, wearing an expensive suit that fit like he'd dressed for a victory lap. He dropped into the chair across from me, drummed his fingers on the table, and smirked. "Big production for a family meeting, huh?" His voice had that same lazy confidence he always carried, the kind of tone that came from believing he could never lose. Thomas arrived last. He was slower now, a little grayer around the edges, his coat hanging loosely from his shoulders. He didn't meet my eyes. He never really did. He sat at the head of the table as if this were still his house, his rules. Rebecca placed a folder on the table and didn't smile. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a battlefield dressed like a boardroom. Linda crossed her legs elegantly. Thomas wanted to handle this quietly. She began, her voice measured. "We're here to discuss the sale of the house. That's all this is. No need to make it complicated." Her eyes flicked toward me for a fraction of a second, the way someone looks at a nuisance they'd like to get rid of. Ryan leaned forward. "Yeah, Ev. It's simple. You've been gone a decade. We've kept everything running. Selling it makes sense." He paused, letting the smirk spread wider. "Besides, you don't exactly need a house you never wanted." I didn't answer. I glanced at Rebecca, who gave the smallest nod. Thomas cleared his throat, his voice quiet and distant. "Let's just keep this civil. Please." Linda gave him a thin smile, then turned to me. "We've already had it appraised. It's a good offer. You'll get your share. It's more than fair." She said it like she was being generous, as if she wasn't talking about erasing the only thing left of my mother. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. My voice was calm even. Fair is an interesting word coming from people who nearly killed me 3 weeks ago. The smile on Ryan's face froze for half a second. Linda blinked. "Excuse me." Rebecca opened the folder slowly, deliberately. "My client is not here to negotiate the sale of the property," she said, her voice clear and hard. "She's here because there is a pending criminal investigation." Ryan let out a sharp laugh, loud and forced. "Are you kidding me? You're still on that." "It was an accident." "Was it?" I asked softly. I reached into my bag and placed a small black recorder on the table. I pressed play. The sound filled the room instantly. Ryan's slurred voice hissing that I didn't belong. The scrape of the garland tightening my gasping breath, the sharp snap of a chair falling, and Linda's unmistakable laugh, low-cold, unbothered. The room changed in an instant. Ryan's smirk disappeared completely. Linda's face went pale under her makeup. Thomas shifted in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. The sound of my strangled breathing played on louder than the silence that followed. Rebecca didn't flinch. She didn't look at them. She let the recording play until the last faint echo of my body hitting the floor faded into nothing. Ryan was the first to speak, his voice cracking. "That doesn't prove anything. You don't see anything. It's just noise." I slid the second item across the table, a printed still image from the security footage. It showed him with the garland wrapped around my neck. Linda's figure stood in the doorway, clearly visible. His hands were clenched. Mine were clawing. It was grainy, but undeniable. Linda's carefully built mask started to crack. "This is absurd. You can't use that." "That's perfectly legal," Rebecca cut in smoothly. "Vermont is a one-party consent state. The footage was recorded on my client's family property where she has equal ownership. It's admissible." Thomas looked down at the table. He hadn't said a word. Ryan pushed back from his chair, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. "This is a setup. You came here to blackmail us." "No," I said quietly. "I came here to end it." There was a knock on the door. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the room. One of them was Officer Parker. He didn't smile, didn't nod. "Ryan Carter," he said. "You're under arrest for aggravated assault and attempted homicide." The silence that followed was electric. Ryan's face went bloodless. Linda stood up, her voice breaking for the first time. "You can't do this. You can't just—" Parker turned to her. "Linda Carter, you're being brought in for questioning for obstruction of justice and providing false statements to law enforcement. Please remain seated." She froze, gripping the edge of the table like it might save her. For the first time in my life, I saw her without the armor of her performance. Just a woman caught with nowhere to run. Rebecca closed the folder with a soft click like punctuation. "You've spent a long time controlling the story," she said evenly. "Not anymore." Ryan started shouting as they handcuffed him. Every word he spat sounded smaller than the last. Linda kept whispering Thomas's name like it was a prayer that could change something. Thomas never looked up. The officers led them out one by one. The door shut behind them, and for the first time, the house's story didn't belong to them anymore. Rebecca turned to me. "You did it." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The sound of their voices, their laughter, their control had haunted me for decades. But in that room with their faces stripped bare, I felt something I had never felt around them before: power. Not the loud kind, the quiet, steady kind that no one could take back. Thomas was still sitting at the table. He looked smaller, like the years of looking away had finally settled on his shoulders. "Evelyn," he said softly. His voice was shaky, like he was realizing just how much silence can cost. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Outside the windows, the snow was beginning to fall again, soft and clean. For years, every Christmas had felt like a wound. Now it felt like something was being scraped clean. As Rebecca gathered the paperwork, I glanced once more at the chair where Ryan had been sitting, the place where he'd laughed like nothing could touch him. I would never forget the sound of that laugh disappearing. I stood, buttoned my coat, and followed Rebecca toward the door. As we stepped outside into the cold, the snow fell around us in slow, deliberate flakes. Each one landed softly on my skin, melting instantly, like the weight of a life I was no longer forced to carry. What would you do if the people who hurt you finally got exposed? Comment your answer. February came quietly, but the air in Vermont still carried winter's edge. My office on the second floor of an old brick building in Montpelier overlooked the street below, where the snow had hardened into gray banks that refused to melt. I sat at my drafting table surrounded by blueprints and sketches, the smell of graphite and paper steadying me in a way nothing else could. The world outside had moved on, but the storm I had unleashed was still unfolding. Ryan was in jail. Linda was under investigation. Thomas had lost the house that was never truly his. For the first time in years, the silence that followed me wasn't suffocating. It was deliberate. It was mine. The first call came just after noon. My phone vibrated across the desk, lighting up with a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated before picking it up. The moment I heard the voice on the other end, I didn't need a name. Linda's sobbing wasn't real sobbing. It was the kind of crying she used when she needed something. Wet and breathy, but calculated. "Evelyn," she said, dragging out my name like a lifeline. "Please, please listen to me." I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the pale sky. "You shouldn't be calling me." Her breath hitched. "He didn't mean it, Evelyn. He's not a monster. He just lost control. It was Christmas. He'd been drinking. He loves you in his own way." She paused, giving me space to soften. "I didn't." "You watched," I said. My voice was low even. "You didn't stop him." "I was scared," she whispered. "I didn't know what to do." That was the lie she'd always told, that she was powerless when the truth was she'd built the world where his hands could tighten and everyone else looked away. "He's my son," she continued. "They're going to put him away for a long time. If you help him, if you just talk to the prosecutor, they might reduce the charges. I know you're angry. I know you hate me. But please, Evelyn, he's still family." I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, a gust of wind blew a curtain of snow off a nearby roof. The flakes scattered like ash. "He tried to kill me," I said quietly. "And you let him." Linda's breath caught. I imagined her in that big, empty house, sitting where I used to sit as a child, trying to control the story again. But she didn't understand. The story was no longer hers. "I can't lose him," she said, her voice rising cracks, showing through the performance. "You have no idea what prison will do to him." I almost laughed. The irony of it was sharp enough to cut. Then he should have thought about that before he wrapped his hands around my throat. She went silent. I waited. Then I ended the call. I didn't scream. I didn't shake. I just pressed the red button and watched her number fade from the screen. Then I blocked it. The letter arrived 2 days later. My name was scrawled across the envelope in handwriting I recognized immediately. Ryan's. For a long time, I didn't open it. It sat on the corner of my desk like a shadow that refused to move. Finally, one night, after everyone else had gone home, I slid a finger under the flap and pulled the paper out. "Evelyn," it began. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know I'm sorry. That night, I was drunk and angry. You know how things have always been between us. I lost control. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. I didn't want to hurt you. You're my sister. Family. If you tell them I didn't mean it, they'll listen. You have that power. Please. I need you." I read the words twice, not because they were convincing, but because they were so painfully familiar. He wasn't apologizing. He was bargaining. That was all Ryan ever did. He'd spent a lifetime taking what he wanted, certain that the rest of us would fold eventually. But the person he was writing to no longer existed. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and dropped it in the metal bin behind my building. The paper caught the wind before disappearing into the darkness. Thomas came next, not with tears, not with letters, but with a voice that sounded tired. He showed up at my office without calling, standing in the lobby and his old wool coat hat in hand, like someone visiting a grave. My receptionist buzzed him up reluctantly. When I opened the door, he looked smaller than I remembered. "Evelyn," he said. His voice cracked on my name. "Can we talk? I didn't invite him in." He stood in the doorway, snow melting off his shoes. "I know you don't owe me anything," he continued, "but I'm asking you, for the sake of what's left of this family. Don't let him spend his life behind bars. He's my son." "He tried to kill me," I said. My tone didn't change. Thomas flinched. "He's paying for it now. You've won. He's scared. Linda's breaking. And me." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I should have done something. I should have stopped him. I know that. But we're family. Don't destroy what's left." I stared at him, and for a moment I saw the man he'd always been. The one who didn't raise his voice, didn't take a stand, didn't protect anyone. The man who had watched. And I understood then that his silence had always been its own kind of cruelty. "There's nothing left to destroy," I said softly. He nodded slowly, like he already knew the answer. Then he turned and walked away. His footsteps down the hall sounded small. I went back to my desk, pulled my coat tight around me, and stared out the window at the snow falling against the streetlight. It wasn't a blizzard anymore. It was just snow, soft and steady. For years I had imagined this moment, the one where they'd beg, where they'd call me family, where they'd act like the word could undo everything. But family had never protected me. It had only watched me burn. I called Rebecca the next morning. "They're trying to reach me," I said. "I figured they would." She replied, "Do you want to respond?" "No," I said. "I want to end it." And I did. I blocked every number, returned every letter. I didn't give interviews. I didn't show up to court. My lawyer and the prosecutor had everything they needed, the footage, the recording, the bruises, the timeline. My silence wasn't a shield anymore. It was a blade. The trial moved faster than I expected. Ryan was officially charged with aggravated assault and attempted murder. Linda faced criminal investigation for obstruction of justice and false reporting. Thomas lost all rights to the estate in the civil suit Rebecca filed. The house that had been their stage for decades was now frozen by the courts. The night after the verdict came through, I stayed late at the office. The building was quiet, except for the sound of the wind outside. I turned off the lights and stood by the window watching snow fall in slow spirals under the streetlight. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, not the girl who left Burlington at 18, not the woman who nearly died on her knees in the kitchen, but someone different. Someone who had learned that you can take back power without ever raising your voice. I whispered it into the empty room, not for them, but for myself. No. One word. Solid. Unshakable. It was everything I had never said before. And just like that, the story that had belonged to them for so long finally ended exactly where I wanted it to. Spring crept into Vermont slowly, like it didn't quite trust the ground after so many months of cold. The snow melted in quiet layers, uncovering damp earth, brittle branches, and the smell of wet soil that always came before the lake fully thawed. My new house sat at the edge of Lake Champlain, small and modest, its wooden porch overlooking the still water. It wasn't grand like the Carter house had been. It didn't need to be. It was mine. I woke up before sunrise most days. The air was cool and crisp, the kind that made you breathe a little deeper. My hands smelled of earth from the small garden I had started out back. Lavender mint rosemary. Tiny things that took root slowly, almost shyly, but they grew. I liked the patience of it. Plants didn't demand. They didn't lie. They grew if you gave them what they needed, and they stayed silent if you didn't. I understood that kind of language better than I ever had before. Every morning I made coffee in a heavy ceramic mug, the kind that kept the heat in. I sat by the window overlooking the lake, the glass still fogging from the difference between inside warmth and outside chill. The water was still half-frozen patches of ice, floating like old memories refusing to sink. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was mine. I owned it now. Sometimes without meaning to, my hand brushed against the faint scar at the base of my neck. It had faded from the angry red it was in the hospital to a pale line. It didn't hurt anymore, but it reminded me of who I had been that night and who I'd chosen to become after. They had taught me silence for years, shaping me with every word they didn't say, every door they closed, every time they watched and did nothing. And I turned that silence into a sword. I remembered the sound of the garland pulling tight, the way the lights blurred in my vision as the air left my body, the weight of his hands, the sound of Linda's quiet laugh in the doorway. For years, that memory had been enough to keep me small. Now it was just a memory. It couldn't touch me anymore. The legal case was over. Ryan had been sentenced to serve time for aggravated assault and attempted murder. Linda was still fighting her own battles in court for obstruction and false reporting, her name whispered in Burlington in a way it never had been before. Thomas had quietly disappeared from the house that had once belonged to all of us. He sent one last letter through Rebecca, one I never opened. When the last of the paperwork came through, Rebecca called me into her office. She placed the folder on her desk, her expression softer than I'd ever seen it. "It's done," she said simply. "Everything's finalized." I ran my fingers along the edge of the folder. For months I had been living inside this storm. Every step was deliberate, every choice sharpened by pain and purpose. And just like that, the last thread that tied me to their world was cut. Rebecca studied me for a long moment. "You don't owe anyone anything," she said. "Not forgiveness, not explanations, not even anger. You've done enough." I smiled for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. It wasn't a bright smile, not a performative one. It was quiet, real. I walked out of her office into the sunlight. It was early spring light, weak, watery, but honest. I drove back to the lake with the windows cracked open, the air still cold but carrying the scent of thawing soil and distant pine. I parked the car and stood at the edge of the porch, letting the wind press against my coat. The lake stretched out before me calm and wide, and for the first time since I was a child, it felt like the world wasn't pressing down on my chest. I spent the following weeks building a rhythm that belonged only to me. I worked on architectural projects in the mornings, answering emails with quiet focus. In the afternoons, I dug my hands into the garden dirt, working its way beneath my nails. In the evenings, I watched the light fade over the water, the horizon bleeding gold into gray. I didn't check the news about Ryan. I didn't respond to anything about Linda or Thomas. I didn't need to. Their lives were no longer my problem to carry. I had thought closure would feel loud, triumphant, like fireworks. But it didn't. It was a soft thing, a stillness that came without asking for attention, a quiet exhale. One morning in April, I found myself stringing a small row of lights across the porch railing, the same kind of lights they used on the garland that night. My fingers didn't shake as I hung them. I didn't flinch at the way the bulbs caught the morning light. I plugged them in and they flickered to life, warm, soft, unthreatening. I stood there watching them glow against the pale blue sky. That was the moment I realized how much power had shifted. The lights didn't own my memory anymore. I did. Some nights when the wind was soft and the lake was still, I brewed tea instead of coffee, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and sat on the porch with nothing but the sound of water and the faint hum of the lights above me. I thought about the little girl who had spent so many Christmas Eves pretending to be invisible at the Carter table. I thought about the woman who stood alone in the kitchen as the garland tightened around her throat. I thought about how both of them had survived. I didn't forgive them. Not Linda, not Ryan, not Thomas. Forgiveness wasn't the prize at the end of this story. Freedom was, and I had that now in full. A part of me had expected the world to be different after everything fell apart, but the truth was the world didn't change. I did. I learned that sometimes peace doesn't come from big victories. It comes from shutting the door and not opening it again. I closed the legal folder one final time that week. No more hearings. No more strategy meetings. No more nights spent replaying everything in my head until it hurt. I placed the folder in a drawer and locked it. The morning after, I woke up early to the sound of rain. It wasn't the cold, punishing kind of winter rain. It was soft and rhythmic tapping against the window like a familiar song. I brewed coffee, wrapped both hands around the mug, and stood by the window watching the lake blur under the rain. I could see my own reflection in the glass. Stronger, older, steadier. For years I had feared that their voices would follow me forever, but all I heard was rain. I walked outside barefoot, the wet porch wood cool beneath my feet. The air smelled of fresh earth and pine. The lights I'd hung swayed gently in the breeze, droplets of rain clinging to the bulbs. I tilted my head back and closed my eyes. The rain touched my face softly, like the world was rewriting the ending without asking for permission. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was something quieter, something cleaner. Justice had already been served in courtrooms and case files. What remained now was mine to keep. I sat down on the porch steps and pulled my knees close. In the distance, the lake rippled under the wind. Somewhere across town, Ryan sat in a cell. Linda was learning that manipulation had limits. Thomas was living with silence of his own making. But none of that belonged to me anymore. I belonged here, in this house, in this quiet, in this moment. They taught me silence. I turned it into a sword. And now, it was also my peace. If you've ever survived a toxic family comment, I see you. Because I do. When I look out over the lake now, it's hard to believe how much of my life was spent in rooms where silence was a weapon against me. It's strange how quiet can feel so different depending on who holds the power. For years, their silence was something that wrapped around my throat, pressing down, forcing me to swallow every scream, every plea, every piece of myself I tried to protect. Now it's the air I breathe. It's the warmth in my coffee cup, the stillness of the garden, the rhythm of the water against the shore. It belongs to me, and no one can take it away again. When you grow up in a toxic family, people on the outside don't always see the quiet damage. They see the big events, the shouting matches, the holidays gone wrong. They don't see the little things that carve pieces out of you over time. The way your voice gets smaller, the way your shoulders fold, and the way you learn to walk carefully around people who are supposed to love you. I learned those lessons too young. I learned how to be silent because speaking up only made things worse. I learned to disappear in plain sight. But the thing about silence is that it's not inherently weak. It can be sharpened, turned into something deliberate. The same silence they used to break me was the silence I used to bring their world down. I never screamed. I never begged. I didn't owe them a performance. I owed myself the truth. I think that's why the quiet moments now feel so powerful, because they aren't born of fear anymore. They're born of choice. The wind off the lake doesn't sound like loneliness. It sounds like peace. The sound of my own breathing isn't heavy. It's steady. I spent so much of my life believing that I had to fix them or prove something to them, or at least make them understand what they'd done. But you can't heal people who enjoy the wound they cause, and you can't save a house that was built on rot. All you can do is walk out. Or in my case, walk back in one last time, not to be part of it, but to tear down the illusion they built. Justice didn't come wrapped in kindness. It came with evidence, with a voice I refused to bury, with their own actions echoing louder than any words I could have said. And when the world finally saw them for who they were, I didn't feel vindicated in the way movies like to show. I felt still, calm. It was like standing outside after a storm and realizing the roof didn't fall on me this time. That stillness is everything. If you've lived through a toxic family, if you've felt invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to love you, I want you to hear this clearly. Your silence doesn't define your weakness. It doesn't make you complicit. It doesn't make you small. It's a weight they trained you to carry, but it can also become your strength. One day, if you choose, you can set it down, or sharpen it, or both. When I hung the string of lights on the porch, I didn't do it to celebrate anything. I did it to reclaim something, the same kind of lights they used on that garland the night he tried to end me. They thought they owned every piece of my story. They were wrong. I stood under those lights and felt nothing but warmth, no shaking, no shadows, just light. I don't forgive them. People think forgiveness is the key to peace, but peace doesn't always require forgiveness. Sometimes it requires the quiet decision not to carry what isn't yours anymore. Sometimes it's standing still and letting the world know you survived. I look at the water and I think of the people who will never know what it's like to be believed. I think of the ones who have endured years of cruelty wrapped in the disguise of family dinners and polite smiles. The ones who were told they were dramatic, ungrateful, overreacting. I was one of them. I see them. I also think of the ones who found their way out. The ones who built their lives from scraps of hope and hard resolve, who turned their pain into something steady and quiet and real. The ones sitting alone on porches like this, breathing air that finally belongs to them. This story isn't about revenge anymore. It's about reclamation. I didn't take back everything at once. I didn't burn their world down in a single night. I built my own, one deliberate step at a time. And I learned something along the way. Survival doesn't always look like a war cry. Sometimes it looks like planting a garden, drinking coffee by a window, letting the quiet in. So if you've ever survived a toxic family, if you've ever been made to believe that your voice didn't matter, if you've ever walked out of a room with your chest tight and your throat burning, hear me now. I see you. I see the way you've carried pain that should never have been yours. I see the way you've survived in silence. I see the strength it takes to still be here. You are not weak for what you endured. You are not broken for choosing quiet over screaming, and you don't owe anyone your forgiveness, your explanations, or your return. You owe yourself your own life. I close my eyes and listen to the lake. The sound is soft, steady, almost like breathing. For the first time, it doesn't remind me of everything I've lost. It reminds me of everything I reclaimed. If you've ever survived a toxic family comment, I see you. Because I do. I see every quiet victory. Every day you choose yourself. Every moment you stop letting their voices define you. This is your story now, not theirs, and it's worth telling.